What's up, crew? Hope you're having a rad day. Welcome to Raw Vlog number 50. Raw Vlogs are recorded in front of a live beverage and delivered to you raw and unedited. This is the Airhorn channel, which is a companion channel to my main mountain biking channel, MTB Allen. Check that corner link to check out that main channel. If you like these kind of raw vlogs and open-ended discussions, hit the subscribe button, support the channel. I'll show up in your feed. Yeah. So you'll probably already notice that things are a little bit different, and that is because while I was hoping to do something pretty fun for the 50th episode of the raw vlog series, we're going to be getting a little bit serious. And before you get uncomfortable and click away, let me address why I'm going to be talking about serious stuff like race and race inequality and racism on a mountain biking podcast. So while I would love to believe that our mountain biking community is a sort of, as it were, bike race, a race of mountain bikers who aren't affected by ethnicity and race and structural racism. That's not the case, and I've seen evidence of that very recently and have over time seen evidence of that just in the community. So, and also right now things are really turned up, and this is just the kind of thing that I can't ignore. And in any case, raw vlogs are really about, kind of where I'm at this week, what's been going on. And if you've been around raw vlogs at all, you know that we're always broadening this out and talking about life in general through the lens of mountain biking. So yeah, before I go any further, I want to encourage you to do some research, look up Black authors, look up organizations that you can use to learn more about the Black experience, and just kind of take some time to reflect. And let me make it clear that I am in no way trying to say that I understand or know the Black experience. What I want to do here is relate to you some of areas and stories where I have felt a parallel experience, but I also want to talk to you about being a person of color, having my own prejudices, and having to do my own reflection, so that if you are one of our white members of our community, you can maybe see that we all have work to do. And yeah, I just kind of want to leave that there. So let me just jump in. Let me kind of talk about how I have definitely seen levels of racism within our community. We can just start by looking at the industry in general and look at how monochromatic mountain biking industry is largely. I know we can always point to some sorry, I don't have the word right now. We can look at exceptions, but the mere fact that that person is an exception tells you something about the broader pattern. And then this is true of cycling in general, and even more broadly, the outdoor community, and how, so often our outdoorsy stuff, camping, cycling, mountain biking, how they are so very monochromatic, so very white, as it were. Not as it were, just white. And while that might not immediately seem like a big deal, consider how much we get out of mountain biking, out of getting outdoors. Consider the level of peace and activity that we get, everything that we get out of it, and how that's often not necessarily seen as something that's going to be part of somebody's life if they are a person of color, and especially if they're Black. So there's that. I've also just had my own anecdotal experience where I've been around people and have heard things like, no offense, but these dang Asians, or no offense, but these Mexicans, these Filipinos. First off, that's just like, it's a, the, first off, it's just like wrong to be classifying somebody based on their ethnicity. Yes, we can find similarities in different ethnicities, different cultural norms, but to use that in a negative way, in a way to just outright categorize somebody, but then to make that statement to me and then have to add on to it, no offense, but yeah, I'm not really sure what to do with that other than to want to punch the person in the throat. But I don't do that. And honestly, I've kind of done the opposite. I'm guilty of being the person that lets it slide and, maybe even shrugs it off. Laughs in a way that internally I'm thinking, wow, I'm laughing at how freaking ridiculous that statement was. But, that doesn't necessarily get communicated in the interaction. So that's one area where I'm going to be a lot more proactive. And if I'm not going to let those kind of things slide when I hear them come out of people. So, yeah. I do want to tell you a couple of stories from my past that about, just so that you kind of can see where I'm coming from. If I go back to being, a teenager before I was old enough to drive, I got into BMX for a while, and I really dug it. And I actually showed some initial promise with BMX, the ability to just like pick up the dynamics of the bike and just move with it really well, really quickly. I grew up in Tennessee, and in a not exactly rural area in Tennessee, but there were a lot of pickup trucks with gun racks, and everybody, all the other kids in the area were white kids, and I would go to there was like a little track where I would go to BMX, and it wasn't even really a track. It was just like there were some like creeks that like had formed some like areas where people had built jumps and stuff like that. So I would go there to ride and would have fun, and then would find that like if another group of kids showed up, I was at best isolated from them. Like like maybe we would ride together a little bit, but I could never like make friends with them, and could like I remember times when we would be riding kind of together, and then we would go by one of their houses, and the other kids could go inside, but I was just kind of less than subtly left outside. Maybe somebody would bring me out a glass of Kool-Aid. And the sad thing is that was just how it was. I think that's the kind of the endemic aspect of it. And yeah, so there's that. And then I fell out of BMX. Because of racism, which is kind of crazy to say. It's sad to say. Because, who knows where I'd be at now with mountain biking. As a result, I actually got into skateboarding. And part of the reason I got into skateboarding was because of Steve Caballero. He was this short brown dude who was highly respected, one of the best skateboarders around, and everybody dug this guy. And, I could really connect to that. And that was kind of the other thing, like I'd grown up, like listening to Motley Crue and listening to Ozzy Osbourne and all these other bands. And those were the people I saw that, like I would like want to emulate, but how could I emulate them? Because I had this thing that I I could change my clothes, but I couldn't change my skin. I could cut my hair, I could wear an Aussie t-shirt, but I couldn't change the color of my skin, and that always was a dividing factor. And not just in my head, in culturally, just the people I was around. If you walk into an area where everybody's hanging out and you're the one that everybody kind of looks at and has to look up and down and judge, it's kind of hard to shake that, In skateboarding, though, I think I found that there was less of that. It was still there, but I had, this person. I had like Steve Caballero I could look at, and also like Guerrero I could look at, and I really dug that. So, that kind of gets at that aspect of if you are a person of color, and granted, this is getting a lot better, but me growing up in the 80s and 90s as a person of color, all the heroes, all the top whatever, they were generally white folk. And watching the movies, the brown person, the person of color, was either a villain or they were the comic relief, and that's what you had to look. That's what you had to look at. And I fully admit that I decided to be one or both of those at any given time. It's funny to say that because I'm realizing now that like a lot of my kind of jokerness that'll come out is partly fashioned by that. And a lot of my contrarianism has been partly fashioned by that. But yeah. And that's kind of the light aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that if I'm looking and I'm seeing that those are the people that I'm represented by, right? And the heroes, the one that like comes out on top and wins is this white person. What does that tell me about my prospects as a person of color? So, yeah. Another story is, moving forward in time a little bit. And this is one of those stories that I really don't know what to do with. I still don't know what to do with this. But I was skateboarding in downtown Nashville. There was this like place where there was some asphalt that was kind of risen up near a wall, and you could get like cool wall rides on it. And I was like hitting it pretty hard, and I turned around and there's a group of guys standing there, and one of the guys is like, "Man, you've got that wall ride pretty good." And then they started skating with me, and I, however, realized like immediately as soon as the guy was talking to me that this was a group of skinheads, swastikas, the whole thing. And I was uncomfortable, but we were skating, and we did a whole session on that wall, and we're cheering each other on and having a good time. And it was this moment where skateboarding kind of like broke down the barriers of this brown guy and these group of skinheads. So we finished the session, and then they began to leave, and one of them hung back. And as the others were skating away, this one that hung back looked me in the eye and said, "This has been cool, but if we're not on skateboards, you need to stay the hell away from us." So what do I do with that, right? Skateboarding had brought us together, except not really. Yeah. So, another event was I was actually here in Southern California. I was living actually in the same town that I live in now. It's at the time it's still kind of this way, but it was even more so predominantly white at that time, relatively affluent neighborhood. And I lived in an apartment in this neighborhood, and I was walking home. It was like early afternoon, and I had a police officer pull me over, like like pull over in his car, tell me to sit on the curb. And he had me on the curb. He had me pull out my ID, asked me what I was doing, where I was going, like literally asked me, what are you doing in this neighborhood? And when I told him that I was just headed to my apartment, he was very incredulous, asked for my ID. Fortunately, I had my current address on my driver's license. When he saw my last name, he said, "Is that Mexican or something?" So I don't know if you've had that experience. If your name is Bloker or Smith or, Robertson, if you've ever had a police officer ask you about your ethnicity based on your last name, or if you've been stopped going home to your apartment. I even had this happen in a place where I'd been living for a year, like with my parents, living in a house for a year. Went for a walk around the block, and before I got back to the house, a police officer had pulled up and said that I had been reported, that a neighbor had reported that somebody was acting suspiciously. And acting suspiciously is apparently walking with a cup of coffee around the block. So, yeah, I don't know if you've had that experience, just going for a walk in your neighborhood. So, yeah, these are some of the experiences I've had. Now, let me take this a little bit further, okay? Because it's not like... So these are my personal experiences with racism. And I want to make it clear that this is different, somewhat different, than structural racism, systematic racism, things within our legislation, within our operating culture that go beyond these specific incidents. And I don't know how much I'm affected by those more structural things, where I can't really speak to that too much. I don't have like evidence or stories to tell you about that. I mean, I never know like how many jobs I didn't get because I was brown. But because I can't know, I can't really say that. I mean, how many jobs did somebody not get for whatever reasons? But so I can't really speak to that. What's interesting though is, regardless of all this, right? My parents actually kind of instilled some racism in me towards white people. And this was kind of twofold. In one respect, I regularly watched my parents be treated as less than. And we're talking, educated people, both of them in the medical field, both strong-willed enough and dedicated enough to come to the United States. We came out of a country that had just come out of a civil war, a place where I don't know if it still is, but for many, many years, it was the poorest nation in the world. We come from Bangladesh, and they put in the work and they took the risk and they did so much to move to the United States and earned their way. We earned our citizenship. And they did all this work, and we got to a place in Tennessee. At one point, we had like a 4-bedroom house with acres of land, and they earned it. They did the work for it. When we landed in the United States, we had like a couple of $100 and lived in a 1-bedroom apartment where, my parents, like, either we slept in the living room or my parents slept in the living room. I don't remember, but 5 of us crammed into this little place, and they worked their way up, but would still get treated like outsiders and be talked down to by other, white adults. And to see that, yeah, I didn't have the best impression of white people. And then when, my father would come home frustrated from some interaction, or, having a full 32 liters of soda thrown at him just for being brown while driving down the street, I didn't always have the best impression of white people. And then, when, in his rage, in a moment of weakness, would tell me, Alan, don't ever trust white people. You cannot trust white people. Don't think that didn't have an effect on me. But I struggle with it. I constantly work through it. It's funny because, my wife is a redheaded Texan and my stepdaughter is her daughter. And, I have a lot of friends who are white and a whole range of ethnicities. So I walk around with this. I walk around with this, with these experiences, with my story, and I work through them. I think I maybe have the benefit, though, of these things being so vivid in my memory. Things that were, because, backing way up, when I was a little kid, it was me and my family and, things were fine. This is how we lived. This is who we were. And then I remember my first day in elementary school, first grade. The first interaction I had with a classmate, I was standing by a wall, I was by myself, and I was like scared and nervous because I didn't, I had grown up with my family and didn't have any friends. And these were my first potential friends. And these three guys walked up and I was like, oh, I guess I'm about to make friends. And the leader of the three just called me the N-word. Like, there was no nothing. It was just like, you are this. To my credit, I punched him in the face. But, and went to the principal's office, first day of, yeah. But that's how my schooling started. And I don't remember, and we're talking first grade. It wasn't until sixth grade that I made a friend. I had like cordial or, relatively non-violent interactions with my fellow classmates. But sixth grade, this brown guy walked in. And he was a mulatto kid. And guess what? He became my best friend. All this to say that, I have a lot of reason to dislike you and mistrust you and not want to be your friend if you're white. But I've worked through a lot of things. And some of that is working through my own shame of being brown. Because like I was talking about earlier, when I'm looking and seeing these examples of who the hero is, who the good guy is, who all the popular kids are at school, growing up, they were all white people. So in order for me to feel like I could be anything like that, I had to put aside the one thing that was clearly, an identifying aspect of myself, which was my skin color. And I would find myself psychologically forgetting that I was brown. And I would be, walking around and see myself in the mirror and immediately feel shame because of the color of my skin. I even remember having a girlfriend who was, she was actually Native American, but she had really light skin. And I remember I would hold her hand and not like to look at my hand on her skin because it was so dark. Now, where I'm at now is I'm proud of who I am. I love my ethnicity. I love the color of my skin. I love that it's really hard for me to get sunburn. And I don't have shame about my color of skin or my ethnicity. Because I've worked through these things. And that's allowed me to, befriend people of all different ethnicities. It's allowed me to put aside the mistrust and racism I've had against white people that I still work through. It's still there as echoes. But here's the thing. As I was saying earlier, I have very vivid memories of these things. I'm very aware of these things because I've had clear moments, clear times, like going to first grade and getting into that fight and people coming at me, let me finish that thought. But if you grew up on the other side of structural racism, or not on the other side of that racist aspect, you may have grown up in it in the same way that you've grown up in air, like not even realizing it. And to me, that's actually more dangerous. You're not coming at this with the same benefit of hindsight, the same benefit of vivid memories. It might just be the way things are. And I would encourage you to look at these uncomfortable moments, uncomfortable conversations, things that you don't want to look at. When you get bothered by people posting black squares on Instagram, or bothered by the phrase Black Lives Matter, and you want to say things like all lives matter, sit with that for a minute before you respond and consider what's making you uncomfortable. Make a list. Write down 10 things that make you uncomfortable about that. And I mean 10 things. A quick psychological trick there, therapeutic trick there is to force yourself to write down 10 things. You will often break past your initial conscious, rational concepts of why you do something or why you react to something and the way that you react to it. And when you get closer to that 8th, 9th, and 10th thing, you will often get closer to the real reason. Yeah. Sorry, crew, the battery on the camera just ran out, so I had to switch out batteries. So yeah, I think that kind of point came across about, they might be a little bit more subtle for you depending on how you came up. The one thing I did want to address that is kind of subtle is why it bothers me that when people say well, I'm colorblind. I don't see color. I don't see anybody as any different. To me, I find that problematic because my ethnicity, my color, my experience, whether good or bad, is part of who I am. It is part of my story. The racism that I've experienced, the cool things that I've experienced as a result of my ethnicity, all of this, these are part of my story. And for somebody to tell me that they don't see that aspect of me and that's part of how they are able to accept me, I know that person doesn't necessarily mean it in this way, but I find that to be pretty degrading. Almost like it's something like color is something that we have to look past the color, which it's like, it's looking past somebody's bad breath. Okay, I can look past the fact that your breath smells like onions, but I can still talk to you. No, screw that. I say, see the color. And, if you are having to be colorblind in order to accept people, consider what that means. Consider that our color, whatever, white, brown, black, anywhere in between, is part of who we are. We can't change the fact of the past, but by looking at each other's colors and ethnicities as the things we want to know about and being curious and open about them in a way that connects that to that person, that is seen as an integral part of that person, I think is a good thing. It's interesting that we often, I'm just realizing this now, or just saying it out loud, it's becoming a little bit more refined for me that we often talk about our ethnicity in the same way that I would maybe talk about my car or something like that. Like it's something separate from us, but really it's us. We are the ones generating these cultures and ethnicities. Um, because as we all know, it's not as simple as the color of your skin. It's not as simple as your city of birth or your nation of birth or your nationality or your ethnicity. I mean, if you look at me, if you ask me what my nationality is, I love when people ask me that, because the answer to that question is I am an American. I'm a US citizen. So my nationality is America. What's my nation of birth? Well, technically it's Bangladesh, but Bangladesh was East Pakistan up until a few months before I was born, and before that it was India. So then what's my ethnicity? Well, my father is from a village up in the north of Bangladesh, which used to be the north of Pakistan, which used to be the northeast part of India, and he is Garo, and my mother is Bengali. So it's complicated, you know. It's funny actually. If I go back to my time in India, when I spent about 6 months in India, and people would trip out on the way I looked there because my parents are of two different ethnicities. I mean, to a lot of people, I'm just a brown guy. I'm Indian or whatever you think I am. I'm not actually Indian. But even in India, there was this mix of ethnicities that people would trip out on. So these things are complicated. And I think, again, not taking anything away from what is going on with law enforcement and with our Black Americans, not taking anything away from that or trying to tone that down in any regards. But I think when we talk about race, when we talk about ethnicity, it's really easy to forget like how nuanced it all is. And at the same time that we can interact with each other without judging each other for each other's skin color and ethnicity, we can also appreciate each other's skin color and ethnicity and how that is part of our stories, our individual stories. Yeah. All right. That's all I got. See you next week.